This is the story of a very specific ghost, an entity that followed a chilling, unwavering rule. It only ever knocked on Wednesdays. Welcome to the Black Hour Stories. Tonight, we're looking at a case where the horror wasn't random. It was scheduled. For years, a man named Michael endured a haunting that began the same way, on the same day, every single week. And the price of answering the door was far worse than the fear of ignoring it. Listen close, because sometimes, knowing when the monster is coming doesn't help you at all. Michael first heard it a few weeks after moving into the old farmhouse. It was a cold, rainy November, and the house creaked like an old ship. He was in the kitchen around 9 o'clock, drinking coffee and trying to ignore the draft coming from the back door. That's when it started. Knock, knock, knock. 3 hard, solid hits right on the wood of the back door. Michael froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. He walked quietly down the hall, past the dark laundry room. He paused near the door. He could hear the wind outside and the faint, low sound of the old house settling. He told himself it was just a branch hitting the glass. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, sharper, impatient. The sound made the flimsy door rattle slightly in its frame. Michael looked through the small, dirty window pane next to the knob, but he saw nothing but darkness and rain. "Who is it?" he called out. His voice felt too loud in the silent house. There was no answer, just the sound of the storm. He waited 5 long minutes. Nothing. He went back to the kitchen, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He marked it up to kids playing a prank, or maybe a deer. He forgot about it until the next week. The next Wednesday, the rain had stopped, but the air was bitter cold. Michael was sitting on his couch watching TV. The time was exactly 9:07 p.m. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front door this time, right under the porch light. He switched off the TV instantly. He could see the light from the front window, and if anyone was standing on the porch, he should see a shadow, or at least the outline of boots. He saw nothing. He walked to the door, careful not to make a sound on the hardwood floor. He pulled back the peephole cover. The light on the porch was bright, shining on the wet floorboards, but the porch was empty, completely empty. He even pushed aside the curtain on the window. Nothing. Yet, just as he was about to step away, it came again. Knock, knock. It sounded like someone was hitting the door with the heel of their hand, right next to his head. Michael jumped back, his heart pounding hard in his chest. This was not a branch. This was not a kid. The knocks were too specific, too close. He pressed his back against the wall, breathing fast. He didn't move until 10 o'clock, the silence broken only by the clock ticking in the dining room. That night, he felt a fear he hadn't known before. A fear that felt planned. The third Wednesday, Michael was prepared. He locked both doors early and pulled the curtains shut. He brought a thick blanket, a flashlight, and a thermos of hot tea into the guest bedroom, which was in the middle of the house and had no outside walls. He put headphones on and tried to listen to music very loudly. The time came, around 9 p.m. He turned up the music more. He almost didn't hear it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was faint this time, muffled, but it was there. It wasn't coming from the front or the back. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall, right behind the headboard of the bed. Michael ripped the headphones off. The sound was distinct, a solid hit against plaster. He scrambled out of the bed and ran into the hallway. He stood in the darkness listening. The knocking stopped as soon as he left the room. It was like the thing knew exactly where he was and where he wasn't. This was the first time the entity had entered the structure of the house itself. The fear went from a simple scare to a real, creeping panic. This thing was inside his safe place. For the next few weeks, Michael tried to break the pattern. He went to a friend's house on a Wednesday night. He drove to the next town and stayed in a motel. The haunting stopped, but only for him. His friend later told Michael that the night he stayed over, someone had knocked fiercely on his back door around 9. But when he opened it, there was nothing but a heavy fog rolling off the lake. The motel clerk, when Michael checked out, asked him why he kept running in and out of his room late on Wednesday night, saying he heard Michael knocking constantly on the walls. Michael went home knowing that the entity wasn't attached to the house. It was attached to him. It followed him, and it marked its territory every Wednesday night at the same time. The rules were simple, chilling, and absolute. If he was home, it would knock on his door or his wall. If he left, it would follow him and announce itself wherever he was staying. He started keeping a journal. Every Wednesday, he wrote down the time, the location of the knock, and the feeling it gave him. He noticed a detail he had missed before. When the knocking started, the air always went completely dead. All the normal house noises, the refrigerator hum, the pipes ticking, the wind outside, they all disappeared for a few minutes. It was a silence that felt heavy, a silence that felt like a held breath. One Wednesday in January, it got closer. Michael was sitting on the kitchen floor, far away from all the doors. He was trying to read, but he kept watching the clock. 9:05 p.m. The silence hit him, a sudden drop in the background noise. His ears started to ring faintly. Then the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was right in the middle of the kitchen, on the top of the dining table. A light coat of dust had gathered there, and where the knock hit, a tiny cloud of dust puffed up, settling back down immediately. It was not knocking on a door anymore. It was knocking on the furniture. The next week, it knocked on the metal side of the stove. The week after that, it knocked on the glass of a picture frame on the mantelpiece. The knocking was moving inward, getting smaller, more intimate. It was announcing itself on the objects Michael touched every day. The terror peaked the next month. Michael had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the constant fear. He woke up suddenly. The clock read 9:15 p.m. He must have slept through the usual starting time. The room was dark, but he could feel the dead silence. He lay still, listening. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. Maybe it had missed him. Maybe he was finally free. Then he felt it, a light tap. Not a knock on the wood or the glass. A light, delicate tap like a fingernail on his forehead. Tap, tap, 3 fast, soft sounds. Michael didn't scream. He couldn't. He just clamped his eyes shut and held his breath. He felt the cold air of the kitchen shift above him, like something very tall was leaning down. Then silence. The house noises slowly started to come back. The refrigerator started humming again. He knew then that the knocking wasn't a warning. It was a request. It was an action. It needed to knock. It needed to touch. It was trying to get him to open the door, whether a physical door or a door to his attention. He spent the next 3 months simply surviving, living with the chilling weekly routine. He would barricade himself in the closet on Wednesday nights and wait for the tap on the wood or the knock on the ceiling above his head. One week, Michael was cleaning out the small utility closet under the stairs. He found a very old, small book tucked into the corner of a shelf. It was bound in rough brown leather, and the pages were stained yellow. The text was handwritten and hard to read. It seemed to be a series of diary entries from the 1920s. The person writing the entries was a woman who lived in the farmhouse, and her first entry about the phenomena was dated on a Wednesday. She wrote about a specific sound, a triple announcement. She wrote that her husband had disappeared after opening the back door on a Wednesday night when he heard the 3 knocks. She warned herself in shaky cursive to never answer the knock. Michael finally understood. The entity was demanding entrance. And if he answered, if he let it in, he would be gone too. This was the entity's twisted routine, its way of feeding. It was a rule, not a choice. He decided he had to leave the house, the county, maybe the whole state. The next Wednesday was his last night there. He had packed his car and was only waiting until morning to drive away for good. He was standing in the empty living room, looking out the front window at the streetlights. The house was cold and empty. He felt the dead silence descend around 9 p.m. He tensed up, waiting for the familiar knock on the glass or on the wall. But this time, it was different. It didn't come from the door or the floor or the ceiling. It came from right behind him in the empty hallway. And it wasn't a knock, it was a scrape. A sound like dry, dead fingers being drawn slowly down the length of the wallpaper. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Michael stood absolutely still, unable to move. The scraping stopped right next to his back, so close he could feel the disturbed air on the back of his neck. Then, a dry, low whisper right in his ear, like old leaves rubbing together. The whisper only spoke one word. You ... That was the last time the entity followed the old rules. It had escalated. It wasn't asking anymore. It was claiming. Michael ran out of the house and never looked back, leaving his things, his memories, and the old house to the thing that kept its schedule. Michael lives somewhere else now, but he still says he can feel it sometimes, a faint, rhythmic pressure on his chest every Wednesday night. The fear is that the entity's power is tied to the rules it enforces, and once it breaks its own rules, there is no stopping it from finding you. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more Black Hour terror. They say you should never buy a piece of land that feels too cheap. And this is the true story of a family who found out exactly why they're perfect. Lot came with a terrifying secret underneath the foundation. Welcome back to the Black Hour Stories. When the Miller family bought their dream lot outside of town, they knew the soil was strange, always a little loose, always damp, but they never guessed that the earth itself was struggling to hold down what lay beneath. Tonight, we tell the story of a house built directly over a forgotten graveyard, and the terrible physical consequences when the dead decide to rise up and reclaim their space. Story: the Miller family, George, Sarah, and their 2 small boys, moved into their new custom-built house in the summer. It was a beautiful place, open and airy, surrounded by thick woods. But from day one, something was wrong with the land. The grass they planted wouldn't take hold. It kept turning yellow, dying in patchy circles no matter how much they watered it. The earth around the foundation was always soft and yielding, like wet sand, even during dry weeks. George complained to the builder, who just shrugged and said it was probably bad topsoil, typical for the area. But it was more than bad soil. Within a month, strange smells started coming up from the basement. It wasn't the smell of mildew or typical dampness. It was a thick, sweet odor, like too much perfume mixed with something bitter and earthy. It made the boys cough, and Sarah had to burn candles constantly just to mask the scent. George went down to the basement, expecting to find a burst pipe or some stagnant water, but the space was dry. The concrete slab foundation looked solid, but he noticed a constant, fine powder of dirt that seemed to gather in the corners, no matter how many times he swept it up. It was like dust was leaking up through the floor. One night, the first truly unsettling thing happened. The family was asleep when a loud, wet thump came from the boys' bedroom on the 2nd floor. George ran up the stairs. He found his oldest son, 6-year-old Toby, screaming and pointing at the rug. Right in the middle of the expensive cream-colored carpet, a huge, dark, muddy stain had appeared. It looked like someone had thrown a bucket of rich, black soil onto the floor. There was no ceiling damage, no open window, and the stain was ice-cold to the touch. It had appeared instantly, like a dark bruise spreading across the fabric. Sarah tried everything to clean it, scrubbing and scrubbing until her hands were raw, but the mud seemed to be ingrained in the fibers. It was the first sign that the earth beneath the house was trying to push its way inside. The next few weeks, the phenomena escalated. The sweet, bitter smell in the basement got stronger, and the fine dust George kept sweeping up started to gather into small, cone-shaped piles. It looked like tiny volcanic mounds of dirt rising from the edges of the concrete floor. George poured cement patch over them, but the next day, the dirt piles would simply break through the new layer and start forming again. It was a relentless, silent invasion from below. George finally called a local historian, an older woman who specialized in old maps. He told her about the strange soil and the smells. She sounded cautious on the phone. She told him that she'd heard a story about that exact plot of land. It wasn't a farm, and it wasn't a forest. It had been a small, private burial ground for a very poor settlement in the late 1700s, and it was never officially mapped or moved. When they built the modern subdivision, they simply paved over the area. The historian said they probably built the Miller house right on top of the graves. This information chilled George to the bone. He told Sarah, and they both looked at their beautiful new home with absolute dread. They were living in a house built on top of dead people, and those dead people were starting to fight back. The physical effects became impossible to ignore. The house itself started to shift. Cracks appeared in the plaster walls, zigzagging across the ceilings like lightning strikes. The floorboards in the dining room began to buckle, rising up in the center as if something underneath was pressing against them. When George tried to walk across that area, it felt hollow, and sometimes he would hear a faint, scraping sound from below, like stone on stone. One evening, Sarah was putting the boys to bed. As she tucked the younger one in, she noticed something odd about the bedside table. It looked like it was growing. At first, she thought it was the lighting, but she moved closer. The solid oak leg of the table was covered in a thin, moist layer of black fungus and tiny, pale white roots that were actually growing right into the wood. The moisture seemed to be seeping up from the floor and feeding this awful growth. When she touched it, the fungus felt cold and strangely brittle, like dead skin. She called George up, and he tried to scrub the growth off, but it wouldn't move. He had to take a small knife and scrape the fungus away, and underneath, the beautiful oak wood was stained black and soft with rot. They realized that whatever was down there in the earth was bringing up more than just dirt and smell. It was bringing up rot and decay, using the very structure of their home as a path. The worst part of the haunting wasn't the noises or the cold. It was the feeling of being suffocated by the land. They couldn't open the windows because the sweet, cloying smell from the soil outside was overwhelming. The air inside the house became thick and heavy, like breathing through wet dirt. The children began to get sick, developing coughs that wouldn't go away and pale, lifeless skin. The doctor said it was just a virus, but George and Sarah knew it was the house poisoning them. They called an excavator, a man with heavy equipment, to dig around the foundation and see what was causing the extreme settling. George didn't tell the man about the old cemetery, only that he suspected a water issue. The excavator started work on a sunny Tuesday morning, digging a deep trench along the back wall. George watched from the kitchen window. The excavator pulled up a lot of dark, rich soil, then hit something hard. The man got out of the cab, scratching his head. He dug around the object with a small spade. He found a large, perfectly smooth piece of granite, too shaped to be a natural rock. As George walked out to the trench, the excavator turned over the granite slab. Underneath, there was a cavity, a space beneath the earth that was dry and surprisingly clean. George looked down into the dark opening. It was a primitive vault, and inside lay the dark, skeletal remains of a small body, probably a child. perfectly preserved in the dry soil. Next to the remains lay a small wooden cross, its wood blackened and nearly dust. Just as George stared, horrified, the excavator's machine roared suddenly to life by itself. The huge bucket, dangling on the arm, swung violently inward and hit the side of the trench with a deafening crash. The sound caused the whole area to shake. George felt the ground under his feet give way. A section of the trench wall collapsed, covering the vault and the remains in a rush of dirt and loose stones. The excavator tried to stop the machine, which was shaking and vibrating like crazy, but the controls seemed frozen. Then, the bucket arm swung again, this time hitting the foundation of the house itself. The concrete groaned and cracked. George didn't wait. He ran back into the house and grabbed Sarah and the boys. He didn't take a single possession, not even his wallet. As they sprinted down the driveway, he looked back. The excavator was still running wild, smashing the foundation and digging into the very earth it was supposed to examine. The sound of cracking wood and shattering cement filled the air. As they drove away, they saw the result of the land finally fighting back. The house wasn't just damaged. The center of the house, where the living room and dining room floorboards had buckled, was collapsing inward. The house was settling down, sinking into the soft earth, being swallowed by the old cemetery underneath. The land was reclaiming the space and taking the structure with it. They never went back. The bank eventually foreclosed, but nobody would buy the lot, not after the official reports mentioned the extreme, unnatural settling and the presence of unmarked graves. The last George heard, the house was a rotting, collapsed ruin, sinking deeper every year into the soft, unmapped dirt of the forgotten burial ground. The earth has a long memory, and sometimes the foundation of your home is just a thin layer of concrete over a history that desperately wants to be unearthed. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you dare to hear more tales of the paranormal, be sure to like and subscribe to the Black Hour Stories.